And I am now going to turn the show over to my colleague, Karen Mossberger, who I have known for many, many years. Professor Mossberger is actually a faculty member here at ASU. She is one of the nation's preeminent scholars on digital equity and inclusion, and survey research on impact of technology. And thanks to Karen, she is going to actually introduce Nicol Turner-Lee, who is our friend and colleague. Karen.
Thank you, Lev, for those kind words. And it's my great pleasure to introduce and to welcome to ASU in Phoenix, at least virtually, Nicol Turner-Lee, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the director of the Center for Technology Innovation and co-editor of the Tech Tank blog at Brookings. I first met Nicol about a dozen years ago when I was living in Chicago at events around digital equity. While Nicol was already in Washington and working on these issues nationally, she had Chicago roots from her time studying for her PhD in sociology at Northwestern and from her work on technology training and digital inclusion programs in the city. I think those two parts of her Chicago experience capture well important strengths in her work. She's someone who can speak to both research and practice with equal authority, who's embedded in both scholarly research and in communities. Prior to Brookings, Dr. Turner-Lee was Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council, a national nonprofit that promotes civil rights and equal opportunity in mass media, telecommunications, and broadband. Before that, she was vice president at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which has long played a leading role researching policy issues related to African Americans and people of color. Nicol founded the Media and Technology Institute there and produced the first national minority broadband adoption study in 2009. Currently, she serves on the Broadband Advisory Working Group of the Federal Communications Commission and on the FCC's Digital Diversity Working Group. She just completed her term as chair of the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference, which brings together policymakers and internet researchers from many disciplines. She's a visiting scholar here at ASU at the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology So Dr. Turner-Lee has been honored with numerous awards as a Time Warner Cable Research Program Scholar, recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from Rainbow Push twice, and as one of the most inspiring women in media from the Alliance of Women in Media. Her new book, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, will be available from Brookings this summer. She uses ethnographic research conducted around the country to look behind the numbers and tell the stories of both urban and rural residents who are marginalized in our increasingly digital society. Beyond telling their stories, she also offers solutions for a more inclusive and equitable future. And I know from having heard Nicol before that she will move you, she will inform and inspire you to pursue those goals for the future of the smart region here. Thanks.
Karen, I was about to cry because when I think about that introduction, I think about, I'm getting old because I think when I met many people, including Lev, I didn't have any kids. When I met Larry, I definitely didn't have any kids. And now here I am with a college student. So it's been an interesting journey. And I'm excited about this book because one of the things I will tell you that it gets harder to write when you get older because you cannot stay awake. And so excited by that introduction, just humbled by the opportunity to be here. Lev, I miss you. We see each other usually in person every year in Arizona or somewhere where Jim Baller takes us. And thank you for having me go after Larry. I really appreciate it. With that being the case, let me just say this, just to expound upon what my friend Karen has said. I'm excited about this conference and I'm excited about it for a variety of reasons. We all in this conference feel like we were the ones at the prom that nobody wanted to dance with. And now everybody is interested in hearing about the digital divide. And so this is one of those moments. It's actually an inflection point in history, given the ugly head of the pandemic, for us to actually make a difference. And as Karen said, I've been committed to this work for almost 3 to 4 decades, believe it or not, as a young student at Northwestern who was working in affordable housing, trying to connect people back then to Ethernet connections. And now here we are today experiencing some of the same challenges. And this book that I'm writing, entitled Digitally Invisible, How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, is not just about the digital divide and the policy that we need to enact to ensure that we don't have this problem again, but it's a memoir to myself as a woman of color who actually was also invisible to many folks in the technological space. And so as I actually provide these comments, what I want to really do is tag on what Larry said, but offer you some of these stories. As part of my book process, I actually went around to about 7 cities in the country before the pandemic hit. And I have to tell you, we had a digital divide before the pandemic. For those people who are just catching on, shame on them, because there were millions of people, millions of school-age kids that were not connected to anybody's internet, who were sitting on anybody's stoop to get access to the internet for homework and other types of functions. So here we are today with, as we spoke about, a potential down payment larger than we've ever seen historically from policymakers. And we have this opportunity, my friends, to either use it wisely or pillage it based on the fact that we know we don't do anything, that we've actually made more people digitally invisible in a highly enhanced information economy. So I want to actually take the time to speak a little bit about some of those stories. And I want to end up by actually leaving you at a space where I think we need to think carefully about the policies that we're putting forth, particularly in the context of this conference, which is looking at the digital divide within a regional context. So with that, let me just share something. There was a commercial, and it was sort of a public advertisement that I used to hear on the radio when I was growing up. Sometimes it would show up on TV. It was about poverty and hunger in this country. And it was particularly related to young people who, at that time when I watched that commercial, the commercial would echo the sentiment that right now there's a child who is hungry. Friends, right now there's a child who's not connected to the internet. There's a child that's actually part of this next wave of the Omicron virus and Delta and other variants that we've seen. There's a child whose school may want to be virtual, but they can't. And there's a child whose school actually went virtual, and they don't know that that child is sitting in their home right now, unable to do homework because they don't have a device or an internet connection. They also should know, but somehow it's not been encapsulated in this third wave of school closures and returns, that that child is also going to be subjected to learning losses. We're going to see, in my opinion, something worse than we saw with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when it comes to the fact that our young people, because of the lack of access, Black kids, 2 years or 1 to 2 years, Latina kids, about 1 to 2 years, low-income rural kids, the same amount of time, where they've actually regressed in learning. Here in the state of Virginia, where I live, we're already seeing that. We've got probably the wealthiest school district in Fairfax County, but yet we're seeing a regression of math scores due to the time that people were out of school. Now, some have argued, while I stay on that young kid, that it's all about getting children back into the classroom. But I'm gonna tell you this, if we stay tied to those institutional frameworks that worked during previous economies of scale, there are gonna be a lot of folks that are gonna fall behind, and this country is going to have a big deficit when it comes to talent for the next digital economy. I share that because these are real issues that actually are occurring because we were not able to provide the resiliency of a network, the basic access of a network to people across this country. Today, I'm talking about a young person. I'm also talking about my mother who sits alone in New York as the Omicron virus is actually taking over that city, who has to use telehealth. And fortunately, she has the resources, but there's someone nearby that doesn't. I'm also talking about a small business that is struggling right now trying to figure out how to get back online because they were not digitally resilient as other large businesses were. Friends, the digital divide, and I talk about this in my book, and I'm gonna tell you right here, it's not about having access to devices and access to the internet. It is actually symptomatic of poverty. symptomatic in a way that being digitally disconnected is a symptom of geographic income educational loss. They are part of and have become part of the continuing violation of civil and human rights of individual people trying to make a living. And what the pandemic did is it actually showed us that yes, as a country, we are resilient when it comes to moving businesses online, at least a few of them, not necessarily the ones that were frontline workers, but it also showed us how important it is to address the accelerated closure of analog in-person systems. As was mentioned, I've been in this space for a long time. I used to work for a company called One Economy. I actually got this space early on in the computer technology center movement. And back then we were talking about people being online versus inline. Karen remembers, Lev remembers. And here we are today, realizing the consequences of a broken and abandoned analog system that you couldn't even apply to get a vaccination if you were not connected to the internet. To me, and this is something that I write about in my book, this is beyond a binary perspective of the digital divide. It's not about who's online and who's not, who has access and who doesn't. It's about how have we created a society in which we've honored this next wave of industrial revolution to ensure that all people are connected. When people do not close the digital divide, or this country in particular, we actually we disservice our own digital competitiveness because we're not preparing people for the future wave of where this economy is headed. Now, I know for some of us here, that may be an interesting and undefined area, but I'm gonna tell you what, Len's gonna have me back when my book comes out in June to talk more about it. Because as I see it, in my visits across the country, people weren't worried about the same things that oftentimes we're worried about. And I want to share a few of those stories just so you see who I'm talking about in terms of digital invisibility. I went across the country to rural and urban communities. And in a rural town here in the southern part of Virginia, I met a young man named Joseph Mulgrave. And he's a fourth generation resident of Stanton, Virginia. I actually wrote about him in a previous photo story. And he told me that he has a phone, but his phone drops off halfway through the month because he loses all his minutes. And as a result, he's a day laborer. He cannot find work. In fact, I just fell to that young man so much that I came back through maybe a couple of weeks later when someone who had read my story had suggested that they would give him a laptop and pay for his service for a year. When I knocked on his door to tell his mother that I was back again, she said she could not get in touch with him. His phone was off and there was no way to reach him. That was 2 to 3 months before the pandemic hit. There was other folks that I met, a farmer in Garrett County, Maryland, who was a third generation farmer who could see the last mile of connectivity from his farm. Unfortunately, Larry, he wasn't worried about precision agriculture. He needed to order supplies and equipment. And every time he had to make that transaction, he had to drive all the way into town about 45 minutes to be able to get access to a sustainable connection to be able to do so. And let's not forget, one of the stories that I actually tell is right there in Arizona, where I visited West Phoenix, an elementary school out there in Maricopa County, where 97% of the kids actually had cell phones. I couldn't believe it. They were elementary students walking around with their cell phones. And the principal suggested that they have those phones, not because they want to use it during classroom time, but because if a parent was deported, that was the only way that they could get in touch with them. Those same kids were unlikely to actually sign up for free and reduced price lunch. And I'm sure today they did not sign up for the emergency broadband benefit simply because their immigration status prohibited them from actually wanting to give that information to get a benefit. These are the stories that Larry mentioned that are happening all across the country. And when the pandemic hit, I had the opportunity to go back to many of those communities. Some people I actually could not find. Some people's businesses were closed. Some people lost that parent that I spoke to. This reality of digital disconnectedness, my friends, goes way beyond what I think we're trying to solve today, which are the same paradigms and frameworks in which we employed almost 2 to 3 decades when I was around. It's not just about service and devices. Sometimes it's not just about digital literacy, because what I'm finding in my studies is that sometimes the grandkid actually does a good job teaching that grandparent how to use the internet. This is about the extent to which we actually look at what we're going to see in this down payment from the Biden-Harris administration, not as a handout, but a hand up. Wrote about this in an op-ed for The Hill right before the end of the year, because I was disturbed that we were sort of regurgitating the same models to address digital inequities. We actually see the digital divide separate from other insecurities that we have dealt with during this pandemic: food and housing, healthcare. But as many of us on this call know, that if it wasn't for being connected, we would not have had a lot of people being able to navigate through this disease or this virus if they didn't have telehealth. Black and Latina patients actually had a 100-fold increase in the use of telehealth services over the course of the pandemic. Now, some of them didn't turn on their phones because they didn't want you to see their house or turn on their cameras, but they used it, which to me is a sign of improving upon health disparities. Some of us didn't know this, that there were startups, young people with startups in Black and brown, tribal, disinvested communities that came out with new ideas to accommodate the changing marketplace of the pandemic, despite years of not being able to qualify for anybody's investment fund over in terms of accelerated investments for startups. These realities have actually peaked during this pandemic. And as this pandemic moves into an endemic, it's incumbent upon all of us on this call to ensure that we have a seat at the table as these decisions around broadband get made. And more importantly, that we shift the conversation, that this is not just something by itself that's a one-time investment, as we have seen actually since the American Recovery Act, but something that actually is part of the economic and social fabric of this country. I think I've sounded enough like a Black Baptist preacher. If you want to say amen from your seat, go ahead and do that. But I want to leave with a couple of points that I think are worth sharing with this group as we have this big task before us. First and foremost, we got to define what we mean by the digital divide. I was listening one day to a hearing about people who are legislators throwing out there closing the digital divide. I kind of got to a point where I didn't really know what they were talking about, except the fact that they wanted to get more devices into the hands of K through 12 students, not recognizing the learning losses were real. Friends, if we don't properly define what we mean as closing the digital divide as not just about the bits and the bytes, but about the investments in communities and talents and skills, we're going to lose this opportunity going forward. Closing the digital divide also entails that we meet people where they're at. And what do I mean by that? In addition to having a national broadband map finally completed somewhere in this process, we have school districts that don't even know what broadband activity exists around their community. We have libraries that opened up their ports and allowed us to have those kids sit safely on their stoops, but we still don't have an asset map of where broadband is, not just at the national, state level, but at our local and community level. Closing the digital divide means that we actually have an all hands on deck strategy, that we provide those resources to the least first before we go out there and figure out ways to provide more on the supply side versus the demand side. I bring those questions up because I challenge anybody to have a conversation on what do we mean by closing the digital divide. There are companies that have showed us already that they've closed the digital divide. Just check your doorstep and see if your package has arrived. There are places that we live, as Larry said, that have closed the divide. I know I have in my household when my kids went back to school, but defining what we mean by closing the digital divide to me is so important because it allows us to move past this binary, who's online, who's not, who can afford it, who cannot, who has training, who does not, to something that understands that if you do not have access to broadband and you do not have access to a credit card or other financial collateral, you're not participating in this digital ecosystem. If you don't have access to tools, you may not work in a network, in a system that is actually going to build upon networks for you to be able to have the training and skills to get that job. What does closing the digital divide mean? And I love that Jessica put in the chat, what does digital redlining mean? So we actually have those conversations before we allocate this money. And there are plenty of people on this call that actually can help people understand what we mean by that. The second thing I would just say, we need to understand as we have this huge down payment on broadband, how this money is going to be allocated, not just on the projects and programs, but we need metrics and outcomes. How will we know in the next 5 to 10 years that we've done a good job? That kid that I talked about earlier is not sitting at home. I wrote about a few months ago when our children were out of school that America needs that no child should be left offline ever again. We have school districts right now that cannot even consider virtual the third time around, my friends, simply because the CARES Act money is expiring and philanthropy doesn't know how to support these resilient hotspots and other levers that help teachers do their job. We need states to understand that they have to pull up more seats at the table. Just last week, I spoke to the Virginia Association of Superintendents, who are actually talking to their state legislators at a conference the next day. The question that they asked me that made me feel that I was not wrong is, what should we be asking our state legislators? When it comes to having this allocation through the states, it's important that we have the states be as collaborative and representative when it comes to who's at the table making these decisions. Where's ASU? Where's that local business? Where's that faith-based institution or community organization that served as a gap stop? What library is represented? For me, that's most important. And can I push it? States should also have digital equity plans. Not only should they have people at the table, but they should also be responsible for delivering an equity plan to the feds that says, here's how we're going to close the divide, and here's who we're going to serve first. At Brookings, we're about to embark on a study, which is the first empirical research on how Blacks and Hispanics in the rural South use broadband. They're a hard population to get through, but we actually figured it out with the goal of really understanding how significant place is when it comes to actually solving these issues. Some of you have heard me talk. No, I don't deal in language of rural divides and urban divides. I deal in language of rural solutions and urban solutions. Having this sense, again, for states, that what we may be dealing with is not just about, I was actually kind of kicked off a podcast the other day when I told my friends, Lev and Fiverr, that may not be the only answer. We may have to think of other solutions, particularly in communities that are 500 people. Do you want to put all the money in fiber? We may have to be creative, my friends, particularly as our states get these allocations, to develop what I call these tech ecosystems that contribute to more efficacy and resiliency of these networks. So I'm gonna get to my third point and then I'm gonna shut up. As I've mentioned so far, we need to define how we're closing this digital divide. We need to make sure this allocation of this new down payment on broadband, that we have representative work teams and collaborative work teams addressing equity, as well as understanding that this is not a wholesale solution to development. And third, I'll say this, and I think this is why Lev invited me to this conference. We actually have some models to draw from when it comes to closing the divide. And I love the way Larry and others have talked about smart cities. People have sort of forgotten that we spent a lot of time talking about smart cities. And I was asked the other day by a legislator my opinion, and then I gave them I promoted Lev your conference for something they should listen to. And I said, smart cities will keep our policymakers contained to urban. We should actually be talking about smart regions. And that's why we're here today. This is not an approach, friends, that all of us on this call have not been around before. As my grandmother has said, sometimes when I was acting up as a little kid, she used to tell me, and some of you may have heard this, you've been here before, child. I see behaviors in you to tell me you have been here before. Now, for those of you from the South know that that means that she thought I had lived and died and came back. I must have been a caterpillar raised in hell for her. But I share that because there's an assumption that we have not been here before. And as we move forward, I think this all hands on deck strategy, things that I've talked about, things like a tech new deal, no child left offline, this basis for our universal service, the contract that we've broken when it comes to affordability, service quality. We've been here before. And now it's up to us if we really want to close the divide for Joseph Mulgrave and John Yoder and Janice Fleming and Marion, Kathy Trimble from Marion, Alabama. We need to sit back and say, with the experts on this call, how do we create models that are sustainable, but how do we create models and metrics and outcomes that are strategic? I'll say this as I close. See, Larry already stole my Martin Luther King quote because I was actually going to go there as part of my close, as we are actually right here at this moment of celebrating a man who actually fought for freedom. And I'm one of those people that I was always caught between Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and W.E.B. Du Bois when it came to the type of self-determination that we needed to move forward. And I'll just share it like this as I wrap up my talking. We have this huge opportunity to close the digital divide. But first, we have a huge opportunity to close the polarization, the income inequality, the geographic misrepresentations, the misinformation and misidentification, and the challenges that have historically persisted in this country. Being disconnected is symptomatic of poverty. And it's symptomatic of poverty in an increasingly information economy where if you don't have it, you don't know it, you've not touched it, you cannot partake in it. As an active producer, you stay a passive consumer. And for all of us who know what it was like to take typing back in the days of high school, because that was the skill that we needed to get a job. Thank God that was not the only skill we could use to get a job, particularly for those of us from the Rosie the Riveter phase, right? The women who were forced to take typing. We can't put people who are everyday folks, and that's why I call my book The New Underclass. This is not just about the people we've traditionally talked about, the people of color, the tribal, our indigenous friends, the elderly, the disabled. This is about that farmer who's now realizing just how important it was to be connected before the pandemic and going forward. So what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to impress upon policymakers to take approaches that are much different than they've ever imagined, much different than their existing paradigms, and move from these broad stroke wholesale programs to those that actually challenge the status quo and move us towards more regional solutions, more collaborative solutions, and solutions that happen from the ground up. Thank you, Lev. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, everybody, for actually being here and listening to me.
Put your hands together for Nicole Turner Lee. Thank you, Karen Mossberger, for that terrific introduction.